Just a quick piece from Dario Marianelli's score for the provocative little piece known as V for Vendetta. As of course it is November 5th, 2010, my friends. My name's James Evan Pilato. I'm your host and webmaster of the site and show, MediaMonarchy.com, and we're well into hour number 2 on this episode 193, and we're going to continue at breakneck speed getting into geopolitics. From allheadlinenews.com, Afghan president admits receiving bags of cash from Iran. And of course, the CIA ghost of Osama threatened France on a new audio tape right before the U.S. elections. We'll get to some of the other news about Sarkozy as we travel back in time for what we like to call History Mystery, and something we were going to go over in great detail last week as we were leading into U.S. midterm selections. Minnesota Public Radio, and again, WCCO.com, doing excellent digging and FOIA request filing on Paul Wellstone. It started with a fingerprint of a 25-year-old college professor who opposed the Vietnam War and ended with a search for his remains 32 years later. The FBI files on Paul and Sheila Wellstone, many of which are being made public for the first time, shed new light on the extent of the relationship between the FBI and the political activist who would go on to become a senator for Minnesota. Some of the information uncovered in the 219 pages was new to one of his closest confidants, former Wellstone campaign manager and state director, Jeff Blodgett. The files show that although the FBI initially took interest in Wellstone as part of the broader surveillance on the American left, the agency later served as his protector, investigating death threats the freshman senator received for his views on the First Gulf War, and in the end, helping sift through the wreckage of the fatal plane crash that killed Wellstone and 7 others 8 years ago. Wellstone's surviving sons declined to comment on these documents, which were obtained in response to a Freedom of Information Act request filed by Minnesota Public Radio News. So again, Minnesota Public Radio as well as WCCO. FBI files on Wellstone give new details on the threats against him.
Today marks the 8th anniversary of the death of Senator Paul Wellstone and 7 others in a plane crash. And new documents obtained by Minnesota Public Radio through the Freedom of Information Act show that Wellstone was under surveillance by the FBI long before he became a United States Senator. Pat Kessler joins us now from St. Paul to tell us more. Pat, were you surprised by this?
Yeah, it was fascinating stuff I've never heard before. It shows these documents that the FBI had Wellstone under surveillance since 1970, when he was a Vietnam War protester. Many years later, FBI was investigating death threats against Wellstone as a U.S. Senator. And the FBI investigated clearly, over time, deliberately, foul play in the Wellstone plane crash after it went down. FBI agents from Duluth went immediately to the Eveleth crash site. They were on the scene as the rest of the world was learning of the tragedy.
A very sad moment that we have to report Senator Paul Wellstone aboard a small plane that crashed.
The documents obtained by Minnesota Public Radio show the FBI followed a number of criminal leads in the first 2 days of the investigation. Handwritten pages noted the initial search found no cockpit voice recorder and no bullet holes. The documents show an FBI evidence team searched the wreckage for 2 days, first looking for aircraft parts, then retrieving human remains and personal items. Among the claims the FBI investigated and dismissed that the plane was shot down, the de-icing equipment was deliberately disconnected, and a death threat to Wellstone on the day before the crash. Now, the National Traffic Safety Board later found there were no identifiable problems with the aircraft that crashed with Wellstone and all the others on it. It blamed pilot error, Amelia, and said that it was also dangerously low altitude and slow speeds that brought the plane down.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
Now, Pat, the crash happened just 11 days before the election, and there were a lot of conspiracy theories that were flying around back then.
You know, we heard those for months and even years. A lot of people wondering how this could possibly happen with the United United States senator, his family, and campaign workers on board. As a matter of fact, a lot of people were suggesting back then that it was because of Wellstone's Iraq war vote. He was one of the few senators to vote against it. Those have pretty much been put to rest, but that back then, it was still really, really tough for a lot of people.
Yeah. All right, Pat. Thank you.
You got it.
Another October surprise. Another crash of convenience. There you have the Wellstone files. And we'll shift gears wildly while we're digging in the past of history mystery, because, of course, as we noted in that comment earlier on the rally, satire is quite valid social criticism, and, of course, no one does it so cuttingly like The Onion.
An archaeologist is tired of unearthing unspeakable ancient evils. This is Doyle Redland reporting. Archaeologist Edward Whitson had been looking for Bronze Age pottery shards in a recently unearthed Syrian ruin, but once again found himself fleeing giant flying demon cats, locked in a desperate struggle for his life and soul for what seemed like the 1,000th time in his 27-year career.
Just once I'd like to clean up my work area without inadvertently conjuring up yet another tortured wraith or some other howling manifestation of an ancient god king's wrath. Blast it all!
Whitson hopes one day to excavate an ancient Egyptian monastery or marketplace without hearing the usual ear-splitting shrieks of the undead while being swarmed by green glowing carnivorous stink beetles. Doyle Redland for the Onion Radio News, online at theonion.com.
But seriously, CIA misconduct found in 2001 Peru plane crash. That's from the New York Times, and that's something I found while looking at the print edition of The Old Gray Lady while on break at work. And again, with my new Wi-Fi pod, I'm trying to tweet things more. And again, I implore you to check out twitter.com/MediaMonarchy. And I wish we had time to get into this and the dirty details behind another CIA op. William Broe, B-R-O-E, dead at 97. He helped oversee CIA efforts to oust Salvador Allende. You might know that as Operation Condor. You might recall that that essentially took place on 9/11/73. Indiana legislators want to defund the Kinsey Institute. Again, more eugenics. A little bit of good news. The West Memphis 3 to get a new hearing. Technicult.net reporting on that. And, of course, we'll just remind you to go get the essential story from the documentary film Paradise Lost. Ex-FBI agent says, of course, Oswald was a patsy. More on that from .Connector UK. A couple of notes coming from Shrub's forthcoming book, Decision Points. 1, Bush thought about taking Cheney off the 04 ticket, but I'm sure, of course, Cheney said no. And Bush also notes that Kanye's Katrina comment was the lowest point of his presidency. One of the more amazing media moments of the last many, many years, and as we're thinking of V for Vendetta, and then the remake of the show V, and of course one of my favorite films is Pump Up the Volume, my favorite moments in the media are those moments when it goes unscripted, when reality breaks through and they don't know what to do. Do they cut away or they don't? It's amazing. And it's amazing and quite interesting that it doesn't happen more often. It seems Kanye West made his name being anti-authoritarian. Now, of course, if you follow the work of VigilantCitizen.com, you'll find a lot more sinister forces at work in the media industrial complex. We'll close out our history mystery notes with another interesting bit. I was completely unaware, and again, that's what makes all of this so fascinating. Stranger than fiction, my friends, but how do you know what's real and what's not when you have people planning propaganda news inside of the mighty Wurlitzer?
When most Americans open a newspaper, they expect all the news that's fit to print, not to plant. But declassified documents show that in the 1980s, the State Department was doing exactly that. Known as white propaganda, editorials and stories were planted and pushed in major U.S. media outlets, the Washington Post, CBS, USA Today, the New York Times, and more, ensuring favorable coverage of the controversial Contra War in Central America. techniques the CIA uses abroad to influence other populations and other governments.
The Office of Public Diplomacy had a very innocuous-sounding name, but in fact it was a sinister, covert office running illegal propaganda operations.
Hello, my name is Otto Reich.
Meet the man at the forefront of this effort. Cuban-American Cold Warrior and former head of the Office of Public Diplomacy for Latin America. Reich has the reputation of a tough operator.
That's a lie. You are telling a lie.
Employing special psychological operations experts to craft messages for the American public.
Putting people secretly on the U.S. payroll, reporters, writers, and having them then pretend to be independent and writing op-ed pieces, and nobody would know that this was a U.S. government-financed and directed opinion, but from these declassified documents we know that Otto Reich was behind these.
Similar tactics were used by the Bush administration in a lead-up to the Iraq War.
The Bush administration was trying to win the hearts and minds of the American public and the international community and create a reason to go to war in Iraq to overthrow the regime of Saddam Hussein.
The Iraq War is a textbook case of how a government or a cabal within a government uses propaganda, planting stories in the U.S. media to convert public opinion favorably toward a war. Within a matter of days, on September 8th, the New York Times, Michael Gordon, Judith Miller published a front-page long story in which they talked about how U.S. intelligence officials had found out that Saddam Hussein had purchased aluminum tubes, which they believed could only be used for nuclear weapons. What they did not say, of course, was that that was a minority view within the intelligence community.
The drums of war beat faster. The U.S. invaded in March 2003. In 2009, immediately after the president of Honduras was overthrown in a military coup, Otto Reich resurfaced in the mainstream media, quoted by columnists, interviewed by pundits.
Well, when I want to know about stuff like this, there's nobody else better to call on than the guy you're about to meet right here. He can better explain what is happening in Honduras than just about anybody else. Otto Reich is who I'm talking about.
Ever since he was in charge of what he was doing back in the 80s, and he's been around like a ghost, and you see him personally writing op-eds for important newspapers in the U.S., and you see him working behind the scenes for the coup mongers in Honduras, and what you have to wonder is who's paying him to do so.
White propaganda has proven effective in garnering support for America's more contentious foreign policy.
The Office of Public Diplomacy became the sacrificial lamb of the Iran-Contra scandal following a congressional investigation. But Otto Reich moved on unscathed, first to become ambassador to Venezuela, then assistant secretary of state. He remains an influential consultant here in Washington, frequently quoted in the media, and regularly called to testify here on Capitol Hill as an expert witness. Keelan Ford, RT, Washington, D.C.
Oh, of course he's an expert witness. With a name like Otto Reich, it's got to be Nazi propaganda. Let's move quickly now through our holy hexes. We had to add a new subgenre to all the bizarre news relating to the religious wars raging. Clyde and I made a note of this last week. This article from BeliefNet.com. Do politicians need prayers? O'Donnell, Obama, and others say amen. Or amen. Christine O'Donnell said prayer impact her polls. Apparently not enough. CNN asking if the Tea Party is becoming a religious movement. But let's follow up on a story we brought you as soon as the news broke. And again, this is the kind of story that's tailor-made for holy hexes. Satanist event in Oklahoma draws Christian protests.
What you expected. People praying. Serpents in the Garden of Eden. Satanists walked among Christians. This woman began screaming, telling people to kill each other. Some didn't know what to expect.
We just came to check it out, that's all. We don't really agree or disagree with either side.
Most of us have never seen a satanic ritual or exorcism except maybe in the movies. A small group of Oklahomans showed up at the Oklahoma City Civic Center to witness a parody of one.
Not at the Civic Center. It happens every day all over the land, but not at the Civic Center. We have not.
The protest, I thought that that's ignorant for these people to do this, then what would Jesus do? Like, he just open the door and like show love, not come here and disagree and make an argument out of